But of course, Emily, a week can be a long time in politics. So last week, Boris Johnson was talking about ending legal restrictions, and then there'd be a big focus on personal responsibility. And yes, those legal restrictions today are going to be lifted from next week, but then there will be a big nudge from the state. So let's just do a compare and contrast over the week. So last week on masks, the Prime Minister was saying guidance will suggest where you might choose where to wear a mask. The guidance now says the government expects and recommend the wearing of masks in crowded areas such as transport. On COVID certificates, the government last week said these would not be required as a condition of entry to any venue or event, although businesses could certainly make use of them. Now the government is saying it's going to encourage and support business to use these certificates in high-risk settings, and if that's not done properly, then the government may well mandate their use. So let's just take a look at the highly cautious Boris Johnson.
Because the legal restrictions have come off, should not be taken as an invitation by everybody simply to have a great jubilee and freedom from any kind of caution or restraint. That's what we're saying. And I think what the scientists are saying is this is the right date, or as good as any other date to do this, but it's got to be taken seriously.
So that's what the scientists say. What's the science that lies behind it, Nick?
Yes, so to understand that, let's just turn to the minutes of a meeting of the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies on the 7th of July. They, of course, advised the governments. Now, on balance, they made clear that they do support the opening up because they are concerned that you could then delay the wave into the autumn-winter when, obviously, the NHS would find it much more difficult. But then let's just take a look at this language in their minutes. The peak of the resurgence will, however, be much lower if the return to pre-pandemic behaviours is gradual than if it's rapid. And they're then saying that if the aim is to prevent the NHS being under pressure, the priority should be to avoid a very rapid return to pre-pandemic behaviour. Now, let's look at the importance they attach to the so-called non-medical interventions. That's things like mask wearing. Look at this. Maintaining interventions such as more people working from home, the use of masks in crowded indoor spaces and increasing ventilation would contribute to transmission reduction and therefore reduce the number of hospitalisations.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, in a moment, we'll be discussing all that more, the unlocking with a Labour and Conservative MP. But first, to explore why nobody is quite sure where we're headed, here's our health correspondent, Deb Cohen.
The big gamble is underway. After 15 months of COVID restrictions affecting all of our lives, today, confirmation that these will end in a week's time. New models show that there's a great deal of uncertainty in how COVID-19 will pan out in the coming weeks. It's difficult to predict the complex interplay between relaxing restrictions, vaccine rollout and a new variant. But if we don't relax restrictions now, then when? There isn't necessarily scientific consensus. In The Lancet last week, some scientists cautioned, we believe this decision is dangerous and premature. But others are less certain. They say no strategy is risk-free.
I think we've got to open up sooner rather than later. We've done as much as we can to stop people dying on their first infection. And I think, that delaying restrictions at the moment aren't justified and could be more harmful in the long run.
There are other issues beyond COVID to consider, including an immunity debt, where people don't develop immunity to other viruses suppressed by COVID lockdowns, causing cases to increase down the line.
If this goes on much longer, the longer it goes on and the longer that we keep these infections at bay, ultimately it's quite likely that the more severe disease we will see from not just COVID, but a whole range of other infections, that some of which we have vaccines for, some of which we don't.
One of the main pinch points has been the NHS. There are worries about how it will cope, particularly in winter when these kinds of infections tend to be worse.
We could be incredibly lucky, and a cautious approach will actually see there are sort of quite plausible outcomes in which we see very little COVID, but there are quite quite plausible ones in which we see an awful lot and comparable amounts to the previous waves.
Many scientists argue that this coronavirus is here to stay. It'll come into some sort of equilibrium in society.
We are going to get COVID repeatedly from now on through the rest of our lives. Seeing that already in the shift of symptoms that people describe, and it will just be another cause of the common cold and probably won't have that big an impact for the NHS. And we can see that already happening because people who have second infections with the virus, which are becoming increasingly common, aren't actually that sick the second time around.
But when exactly we get to this point is unclear, and scientists are debating what policies should be in place to ensure that people are protected as much as possible.
I think there are no easy answers, but I think there are a few things we're actually still not doing. For example, barriers to quarantining when ill. We know that if you just provide people with financial and actually probably slightly under-discussed emotional support for that isolation procedure, emotional and social support, as well as financial and employment, that is extremely effective. Removing barriers to vaccination, like I said, everyone will agree that is a thing that's worth doing, and actually not an easy answer because it requires a lot of work. So there are a few of these things that while potentially they cost some money and take some effort, are not actually terribly controversial in terms of what their effectiveness will be.
While scientists continue to debate the best way forward, the next few weeks will really show how the gamble of full reopening pays off.
That was Deb Cohen. Joining us now, Alison McGovern, the Labour MP and Shadow Minister for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, and Peter Bowen, Conservative MP for Wellingborough. Thanks very much for joining us. Alison McGovern, can I start with you? Would you say you know how to behave next week in England once the laws have ended?
Well, I hope I know how to behave, and you know, I'm sure that my the details will be uploaded online, and we can all do that thing where we check. And so that we're clear in our own minds. I think the bigger problem for me is that we seem to have gone from Freedom Day to, you know, please everyone be cautious in a few short weeks. And I think that will be confusing for people. So we do need to make sure that people understand how to keep each other safe.
Sorry, so what is the bit that you disagree with then? Is it the Freedom Day or is it the cautiousness?
I would have preferred a different approach from the Prime Minister. You know, we've been asking for more transparency over data for some time. And, you know, boring though it is to repeat myself, it's because that's how you build trust and confidence with the public. And I think there's been more concern for the political messaging and, you know, managing this issue politically than there has for making sure that people are really clear about our best knowledge about what's happening with the virus. Because look, I think that's the way that's the way that support for the measures could have been maintained.
You've heard the scientists, we've all heard the scientists, we can all read the SAGE minutes and see the data there. Would Labour be doing anything different, bluntly? Would you be saying to the public, don't have parties, don't move inside? If it's raining, it's better to cancel rather than have a big group gathering inside. What would you be putting out as your message that you think would make this clearer then if people are confused?
We would be doing things differently. On masks, for example, you know, I speak to shop workers, particularly in Wirral, who are concerned already about, you know, people wearing them. They're in a vulnerable position if people are not wearing them. So we need to keep doing the basics well, and one of those is wearing masks. There's other things that were actually mentioned in the report, and helping people to self-isolate because still too many people can't access financial support that is available, and getting resources to local authorities. You know, only this week, my own local authority has been out making sure that they're really targeting vaccination resources, you know, encouraging people in local areas where take-up is low, doing that hard work to make sure that we get this response right, doing the basics well. And I don't think there has been nearly enough emphasis on that from the
OK, so it's about emphasis rather than changing things. Let me ask Peter Bowen whether you heard a different tone from Boris Johnson today, or whether for you this does mark Freedom Day.
Well, I think it marks Freedom Day, and I don't think we really I didn't notice a different tone. I noticed really that the Labour Party is fully behind these proposals, except for making mandatory use of masks. And to suggest that they're miles apart from the government, I think it is absurd. So I think this is Freedom Day. The truth is, 2 months ago, the major unlocking occurred when we could mix at home, wherever we could go into pubs and restaurants, we could go to cinemas, and schools were in full flow. So I think the major unlocking has been done. This just gets rid of the last remaining regulations, and it's the right thing to do.
Except you just heard from Alison that the question about mandatory masks is a pretty crucial one, because it's not freedom for the person who has to take the crowded bus, who has to clean up the nightclub, who has to be surrounded by people who have made the choice not to wear a mask, which could put them in danger when they're going about their daily job.
Well, the difference between Alison and myself, and I think it's probably a fundamental one, is she believes the state knows best, and I believe the individual knows best, and I think personal responsibility will come through. I think there's an opinion poll that says about 71% of the British people will continue to wear a face mask. I will wear a face mask where it's appropriate. If I'm in a crowd.
So you will carry a face mask with you at all times in case you're in a crowded place?
Well, certainly if I'm travelling on a train, if it's an empty carriage or there's very few people in there, I won't wear a mask. But if I'm in a crowded carriage, I would wear a mask. But I will make other judgments. I mean, if I'm going to the local pub and it's packed, I probably won't go in there. I will make those judgment calls. I'm going on holiday for a week in Norfolk this year because I decided that was a better environment, will be less crowded than some other resorts. So I think everyone will make their own decisions. Freedom of the British people is fundamental, and there is no reason whatsoever now to keep these regulations in place.
Alison, do you think that Peter trusts the British people to get this right more than you do?
I think that the difference between me and Peter is not about whether we trust the British people, because, as he said, surveys show that the vast majority of British people are happy to take steps like wearing masks to protect other people. The difference between us is that I know that COVID might be able to infect anybody equally, but the impact of it is not equal. And whether it was the underfunding, of our NHS that meant we went into this pandemic ill-prepared, or whether it was the high number of people who work on zero-hours contract or work in an environment where, they don't have a lot of say or control about what their job is like. I know that this pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on those people, and I think that the Tories are not concerned enough about the welfare of those people, and I think that is the difference between us.
Peter Bowen, when you hear Sage scientists modelling there could be 2,000 hospitalisations a day at the peak of mid-August, when you say that, hear Chris Whitty say they're set to meet all 4 tests, but he was unsure of preventing unsustainable pressure on the NHS, what happens in your mind if the NHS is overwhelmed?
Well, I think the scientists have all agreed that we should unlock now, and that the great success of the vaccination programme, something Alison didn't mention, a huge world-leading vaccination programme that's put us ahead.
Back to my question: what happens if the NHS is overwhelmed? Would you say it's right then to retreat?
If you let me answer, I will. But if you want to interrupt,
I don't want to talk about the vaccination programme. I want to answer that question, which is what Chris Whitty said today. Unsustainable pressure on the NHS is the thing he's worried about.
Yes, but that's right. If I'm allowed to answer, the vaccination programme is the answer to that question. The vaccination programme has broken the link between transmission of disease and serious illnesses and deaths. So it's a success of the vaccination programme that lets us move forward.
So he's wrong if he says there could be unsustainable pressure on the NHS. Do you think Chris Whitty's wrong then to raise that point?
No, the scientists are not wrong to say if a left field event occurs that we are not aware of or expecting, the government will have to react to it. But there's no evidence of that at all. Okay. So it looks very positive. And it's not all about COVID. It's about the economy. It's about jobs. And it's about people's mental health. COVID is just one illness that we have to deal with.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you.